The courthouse steps in Millfield, Oklahoma, buzzed with the restless energy of a town auction on a sweltering July morning in 1935. Margaret Hartwell adjusted the leather strap of her camera bag, feeling the weight of her Leica press against her hip as Sheriff Thomas Brennan's voice boomed across the gathered crowd. Dust motes danced in the harsh sunlight as he read from a crumpled sheet of paper, his words cutting through the heavy air like a blade through wheat. By order of the county court, the following properties are to be sold for unpaid taxes and debts, Brennan announced, his weathered face stern beneath the brim of his hat. The Morrison Farm, Section 12. The Campbell Homestead, Section 19. The Kowalski Property, Section 23. Margaret's fingers tightened around her camera. Each name on that list represented a family she had photographed over the past months, documenting their struggle against the relentless drought that had turned fertile farmland into a wasteland of cracked earth and broken dreams. Her editor at the Tulsa Herald had sent her here to capture the human cost of the Depression, but what she had found was something far more unsettling than mere poverty and despair. The crowd shifted restlessly as Brennan continued his grim recitation. Women clutched their children closer. Men removed their hats and studied the ground. And Margaret found herself thinking of the strange photographs that had been developing in her makeshift darkroom in the boarding house basement. Faces that shouldn't have been there, appearing like ghosts in the silver halide emulsion of her film. Faces of people who had died the previous summer in the influenza outbreak that had swept through the county like wildfire through dry grass. Miss Hartwell. Brennan's voice cut through her reverie like a whip crack. I believe you have something that belongs to this community. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as every head in the crowd turned toward her. She had hoped to remain invisible, just another observer documenting the slow death of rural America. But Brennan had singled her out with the precision of a hawk spotting a mouse in an open field. The sheriff's pale blue eyes fixed on her camera bag with an intensity that made her skin crawl. I'm not sure what you mean, Sheriff, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the tremor she felt building in her chest. The photographs, Miss Hartwell. The ones you've been taking around these parts. Brennan descended the courthouse steps with deliberate slowness, each footfall echoing off the limestone facade. Folks have been talking. They say you've been capturing things that ought to stay buried. Margaret's throat went dry. She had been careful, or so she thought. The strange faces in her photographs had appeared gradually, first as shadows that could have been tricks of light, then as unmistakable features that belonged to people she had never met, but whose names she had found in the cemetery records. The local newspaper had published several of her images, identifying the mysterious figures as current residents. But Margaret knew better. She had spent hours in the county clerk's office, cross-referencing death certificates with birth records, and the truth had chilled her to the bone. I document what I see through my lens, Sheriff. Nothing more, nothing less, she replied, her fingers finding the small silver cross her grandmother had given her before she left Boston for this God-forsaken place. That's just it, isn't it? Brennan was close now, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the network of fine lines that radiated from the corners of his eyes. You see things that aren't there. Or maybe you see things that are there but shouldn't be. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Margaret recognized several faces from her photographs, people whose families had been devastated by the previous year's epidemic. Mrs. Chen, whose husband had died in the first wave of fever. Old Pete Kowalski, whose 3 sons had succumbed within a single week. They watched her with a mixture of fear and fascination that made her stomach churn. There's a law in this county, Miss Hartwell, Brennan continued, his voice dropping to a register that forced the crowd to lean in to hear him. An old law dating back to the territorial days. It says that anyone who traffics in representations of the dead without proper authority commits an offense against public order and decency. Margaret had never heard of such a law, and she suspected Brennan was improvising. But the crowd seemed to accept his words as gospel truth. She could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on her like a physical force, and she struggled to maintain her composure as the sheriff continued his performance. "Now, I'm not saying you meant any harm, Miss Hartwell. But intentions don't matter much when the results speak for themselves. Those photographs you've been taking, the ones that show faces of folks who died last summer, they're causing considerable distress to the families involved." "I never claimed those were photographs of the dead," Margaret said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "I simply documented what appeared in my viewfinder." "Ah, but that's where we have a problem." Brennan reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded newspaper clipping. "Your editor at the Tulsa Herald has been mighty helpful in identifying the subjects of your photographs. According to this article, you captured images of 12 different residents of Millfield during your documentation project. Would you care to guess how many of those 12 are still breathing?" Margaret's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She had suspected that something was amiss with her photographs, but she had never imagined that the newspaper would identify the ghostly faces as living residents. The implications hit her like a physical blow, and she struggled to find words as Brennan unfolded the clipping with theatrical precision. "0, Miss Hartwell. Not a single one of the people identified in your photographs is still alive. They all died during the influenza outbreak of 1934. The crowd erupted in gasps and whispers, and Margaret felt the ground beneath her feet seem to shift and sway. She gripped her camera bag tighter, as if it could anchor her to reality in a world that suddenly seemed to operate by rules she didn't understand. The faces around her blurred and swam, and she had to bite down hard on her tongue to keep from fainting on the courthouse steps. "I think there's been some mistake," she managed to whisper. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were false. She had developed those photographs herself, had watched the ghostly faces emerge from the chemical baths like spirits rising from the grave. There had been no mistake, no error in identification. The dead had somehow found their way onto her film. "No mistake, Miss Hartwell. The question now is what we do about it." Brennan refolded the newspaper clipping and returned it to his pocket with deliberate care. "You violated the law, disturbed the peace, and caused considerable anguish to the families of the deceased. Under normal circumstances, I'd have to arrest you and let the judge sort things out." "Under normal circumstances?" Margaret seized on the phrase like a drowning woman grasping for driftwood. "Well, seeing as how you're not from around these parts, and seeing as how you might not have understood the full implications of your actions, I'm prepared to offer you an alternative." Brennan's smile was thin and cold as winter sunlight. "You can turn over all your photographic equipment to me right here and now, along with any undeveloped film and printed photographs in your possession. In return, I'll give you 24 hours to pack your belongings and leave Millfield County, permanently." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Margaret could feel the crowd holding its collective breath, waiting for her response. Her camera was her livelihood, her identity, the tool that gave her purpose and meaning in a world that seemed determined to grind her down. Without it, she was nothing more than another unemployed woman adrift in a country that had precious little use for her kind. But as she looked into Brennan's cold blue eyes, she realized that he was offering her something more valuable than equipment, or even professional identity. He was offering her a way out of a situation that threatened to destroy not just her career, but her sanity. The photographs that had been developing in her darkroom defied every rational explanation she could construct, and the thought of continuing to document the impossible filled her with a dread that went deeper than bone. "I need some time to consider your offer, Sheriff," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Time's a luxury none of us can afford, Miss Hartwell. The dead don't keep banker's hours, and neither do I." Brennan stepped closer, close enough that she could see her own reflection in the lenses of his spectacles. "You have until sunset to make your choice. Turn over your equipment and leave, or face the consequences of trafficking with the dead." Margaret nodded. not trusting herself to speak. The crowd began to disperse as Brennan climbed the courthouse steps and disappeared through the heavy oak doors. But she remained frozen in place, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences like a machine calculating the odds of survival. She had traveled halfway across the country to document the human cost of the Depression, but she had stumbled into something far stranger and more dangerous than economic collapse. As the courthouse square emptied, Margaret became aware of someone standing beside her. She turned to find a young man about her own age, dressed in the worn overalls and faded shirt that marked him as one of the dispossessed farmers who had lost everything to drought and debt. His dark hair was plastered to his skull with sweat, and his hands were stained with the red dirt that covered everything in this part of the country. "Miss, you shouldn't ought to be standing here in the sun like this," he said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of someone who had been born and raised in Oklahoma soil. "Heat like this can make a person see things that ain't there." Margaret looked at him sharply, wondering if his comment carried a hidden meaning, but his brown eyes seemed guileless and concerned. "I'm fine, thank you. Just thinking through some problems." "Problems got a way of working themselves out if you give them time," the young man said. "Name's Danny Morrison. My family's farm is the first one on Brennan's list today." Margaret felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. She had photographed the Morrison farm 3 weeks earlier, capturing images of the abandoned buildings and barren fields that had once supported a thriving agricultural operation. But in one of those photographs, standing in the doorway of the collapsed barn, she had captured the image of a middle-aged woman with graying hair and worn hands. The newspaper had identified her as Sarah Morrison, Danny's mother, who had died of influenza the previous August. "I'm sorry about your farm," Margaret said, not knowing what else to offer. "Farm's been dead since the rain stopped coming," Danny replied with a shrug that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "But some things don't stay dead, do they? Some things find ways to come back." Before Margaret could respond, Danny tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her alone in the courthouse square with questions that multiplied faster than she could formulate answers. The sun beat down on her shoulders like a hammer on an anvil, and she could feel sweat trickling down her spine as she contemplated the impossible choice that Brennan had given her. She could surrender her equipment and flee Millfield County like a criminal running from justice, abandoning not just her assignment, but her calling as a photographer and documentarian. Or she could stand her ground and face whatever consequences awaited someone who had somehow managed to photograph the dead, even if she couldn't begin to explain how such a thing was possible. As she walked back toward the boarding house where she had been staying for the past 2 months, Margaret's mind turned to the small cache of undeveloped film hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her room. She had been saving those rolls for the end of her assignment, planning to develop them all at once when she returned to Tulsa. Now she wondered what secrets they might contain, what impossible truths might emerge from the chemical baths in her makeshift darkroom. The boarding house stood at the edge of town like a weathered sentinel, its paint peeling and its porch sagging under the weight of accumulated years and disappointments. Mrs. Fletcher, the elderly proprietor, greeted Margaret with a nod and a glass of lukewarm water that tasted of iron and dust. "Heard there was some excitement at the courthouse today," Mrs. Fletcher said, her pale eyes studying Margaret with the intensity of someone who had survived 8 decades by paying attention to details that others missed. "Just the usual farm auctions," Margaret replied, not wanting to discuss the morning's events with anyone until she had time to process them herself. "Farm auctions, yes. But Sheriff Brennan don't usually single out visitors for special attention unless there's more to the story than meets the eye." Mrs. Fletcher leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You want to be careful, Miss Hartwell. This county has its own ways of dealing with problems, and they don't always align with what you might call civilized justice." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tepid air conditioning struggling against the Oklahoma heat. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that some laws around here are older than the county courthouse, older than statehood, maybe older than memory itself. And those old laws have teeth, Miss Hartwell. Sharp ones. Before Margaret could press for more details, Mrs. Fletcher shuffled away, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that she had stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple assignment documenting rural poverty. The photographs hidden in her room seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and she found herself wondering if developing them would reveal answers, or simply multiply the questions that were already threatening to drive her to madness. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, Margaret made her way to the basement darkroom she had improvised from an unused storage space. The familiar ritual of preparing chemicals and checking equipment helped calm her nerves, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by unseen eyes. The faces from her developed photographs seemed to hover at the edge of her vision, neither fully present nor entirely absent. She had until sunset to make her choice, and as the hours ticked away like drops of water falling into an empty well, Margaret Hartwell began to understand that some decisions could change not just the course of a life, but the very nature of reality itself. The basement darkroom felt like a tomb in the suffocating heat of late afternoon. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled the first roll of undeveloped film from its canister, the metallic smell of silver halide mixing with the musty odor of old wood and damp earth. Through the single grimy window, set high in the basement wall, she could see the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, counting down the hours until Sheriff Brennan's ultimatum would force her hand. She had decided to develop one final role before making her choice, telling herself that she needed to understand what she was dealing with before she could decide whether to fight or flee. The film slipped through the developer solution like a snake through water, and Margaret watched with growing dread as images began to materialize in the chemical bath. The first few frames showed the expected scenes of rural desolation: abandoned farmhouses, rusted machinery half buried in drifting soil, cattle bones bleached white by the unforgiving sun. But as the development process continued, other shapes began to emerge from the silver emulsion, shapes that made Margaret's blood run cold in her veins. In the seventh frame, standing beside a collapsed windmill, she could clearly make out the figure of an elderly man wearing overalls and a straw hat. His face was gaunt and weathered, his eyes hollow with suffering, but his expression held a dignity that transcended physical decay. Margaret had never seen him before, but something about his posture and bearing suggested familiarity, as if she had encountered him in dreams or half-remembered childhood stories. The eighth frame was even more disturbing. It showed the interior of what appeared to be a church or meeting hall, with rows of wooden pews facing a simple altar. But instead of the living congregation Margaret remembered photographing during Sunday services, the pews were filled with translucent figures whose faces bore the unmistakable marks of death. Some showed the fevered flush of influenza, others the sunken cheeks of starvation, and a few displayed injuries that spoke of violence rather than disease. Margaret's hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped the developing tray, sending ripples across the surface of the chemical solution. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around her like the sides of a coffin. She could hear footsteps on the floor above, the measured tread of someone pacing back and forth with the persistence of a caged animal. "Miss Hartwell!" Mrs. Fletcher's voice drifted down through the basement ceiling, muffled but urgent. "You have a visitor!" Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly transferred the developed film to the stop bath, then to the fixer solution that would preserve the images for posterity or condemnation. She had no choice but to leave the photographs in their chemical baths and climb the narrow wooden stairs that led back to the main floor of the boarding house. Danny Morrison stood in the parlor, his hat in his hands, and his boots carefully positioned on the threadbare rug to avoid tracking red dirt across Mrs. Fletcher's floor. His dark eyes found Margaret's face immediately, and she saw something in their depths that made her stomach clench with foreboding. "Miss Hartwell, I apologize for disturbing you, but I needed to speak with you before sunset." His voice carried an urgency that hadn't been present during their brief encounter at the courthouse. "There are things about this county that you need to understand if you're planning to stay." "I'm not sure I am planning to stay," Margaret replied, glancing toward the basement door where her photographs continued their chemical transformation in the darkness below. "That might be wise," Danny said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Though running away won't change what's already been set in motion. Once the dead start appearing in photographs, they don't much like being ignored." Margaret felt the room spin around her like a carousel gone mad. "How do you know about the photographs?" "Same way I know that you developed more of them this afternoon. Same way I know that Sheriff Brennan isn't the only one interested in what you've been capturing with that camera of yours." Danny glanced toward the front window, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. "The dead have been restless since the epidemic ended. Some folks say it's because they weren't properly buried, what with so many dying so fast that the undertaker couldn't keep up. Others think it's because the drought has disturbed their rest, drying up the groundwater that kept their bones settled." "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. But even as she spoke the words, she remembered the faces in her photographs, the unmistakable reality of their presence captured in silver and light. "Impossible things happen every day in this county, Miss Hartwell. The question is whether you're brave enough to help us understand why." Danny moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried across the small parlor. "There's a group of us who've been meeting in secret, trying to figure out what's been happening since the epidemic. We think your photographs might be the key to understanding how the dead are trying to communicate with the living." Margaret's scientific mind recoiled from such supernatural nonsense, but she couldn't deny the evidence of her own eyes. The faces in her photographs were real, as solid and present as any living person she had ever captured on film. If they truly belonged to people who had died during the previous year's influenza outbreak, then either her camera was somehow defective in ways that defied all known principles of photography, or something far stranger was occurring in Millfield County. "What kind of group?" she asked, surprising herself by entertaining Danny's proposal instead of dismissing it outright. "Families who lost people in the epidemic. Folks who've been seeing signs and hearing voices since their loved ones passed on." Danny glanced toward the basement door, and Margaret realized that he somehow knew exactly where she had been working. "We meet tonight at midnight in the old Presbyterian church on the north side of town. The one that's been abandoned since Reverend Williams died last spring. Sheriff Brennan made it clear that I'm not welcome to stay in this county past sunset," Margaret said, though part of her was already calculating how she could attend the meeting without being detected by local authorities. "Brennan doesn't patrol the abandoned parts of town after dark. Says it's not worth the trouble, what with most of the buildings being empty anyway." Danny's smile was grim but encouraging. "Besides, if you're planning to leave tomorrow, what's one more night in Millfield County going to hurt?" Margaret thought about the photographs developing in her basement darkroom, about the impossible faces that had been appearing in her work with increasing frequency. She thought about Sheriff Brennan's ultimatum and the strange law he had cited, about Mrs. Fletcher's warnings, and the growing certainty that she had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple assignment documenting rural poverty. "All right," she said, the words escaping her lips before she could reconsider them. "I'll come to your meeting. But I want some answers, Mr. Morrison. Real answers, not just folklore and superstition. Answers are exactly what we're hoping to find, Miss Hartwell. And we think your camera might be the tool we need to find them." Danny replaced his hat and moved toward the front door, pausing only long enough to add, "Bring your developed photographs." All of them. The dead have been waiting a long time to tell their stories. After Danny left, Margaret returned to her basement darkroom to complete the development process. The photographs that emerged from the final chemical bath were even more disturbing than she had anticipated. In addition to the ghostly figures she had already observed, several images contained what appeared to be messages written in the dust and dirt that covered every surface in the drought-stricken county. One photograph showed the words, "Help us," spelled out in carefully arranged stones beside an abandoned well. Another displayed "Remember" written in the condensation on the window of an empty farmhouse. Most unsettling of all was an image of the courthouse steps where she had confronted Sheriff Brennan that morning, with the word "Justice" etched into the limestone facade, in letters that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Margaret studied each photograph with the analytical eye of a professional photojournalist, searching for signs of tampering or double exposure that might explain the supernatural elements. But her technical examination only confirmed what her eyes had already told her. The images were genuine, captured by her camera through normal photographic processes and developed according to standard procedures she had used hundreds of times before. As darkness began to settle over Millfield County, like a shroud drawn across the face of a corpse, Margaret prepared for the clandestine meeting that would either provide answers to her questions or plunge her deeper into a mystery that threatened to consume her sanity. She gathered her photographs into a leather portfolio, checked her camera equipment one final time, and tried to ignore the growing certainty that she was about to cross a line from which there might be no return. The abandoned Presbyterian church stood at the intersection of two dirt roads that had once carried the traffic of a thriving farming community, but now served mainly as conduits for dust and tumbleweeds. Margaret approached the building through the darkness, guided by the pale light of a half-moon that hung in the star-filled sky like a watchful eye. The church's white clapboard siding gleamed ghostly pale in the moonlight, and its bell tower rose into the night like a finger pointing toward heaven or hell. She found the front door standing slightly ajar, and warm yellow light leaked through the gap like honey from a broken hive. Margaret pushed the door open and stepped into a sanctuary filled with the soft murmur of voices and the flickering glow of kerosene lamps. About 20 people sat in the front pews, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames that cast shifting shadows on the walls around them. Danny Morrison rose from his seat near the altar and gestured for Margaret to join the group. As she walked down the center aisle, she recognized several faces from her photographic documentation of the county. Farmers and their wives, shopkeepers and laborers, people whose lives had been shattered by drought, depression and disease, but who had somehow found the strength to continue searching for meaning in their suffering. "Friends," Danny said, his voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary, "Miss Hartwell has agreed to share her photographs with us tonight. As you all know, her camera has been capturing images of our loved ones who passed on during the epidemic. We're hoping that these pictures might help us understand what they're trying to tell us." Margaret opened her leather portfolio and began distributing the photographs among the assembled group. The reaction was immediate and intense. Gasps of recognition, tears of joy and sorrow, whispered conversations as family members identified faces they thought they would never see again. An elderly woman named Mrs. Kowalski clutched a photograph of her deceased son to her chest and rocked back and forth in her pew like a mother comforting a crying child. "This is him," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "This is my Johnny, just as he looked before the fever took him. But how is this possible? How can he appear in your photographs when he's been dead for more than a year?" Margaret had no answer to offer, but Danny stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had given considerable thought to such questions. "We think the dead are trying to communicate with us through Miss Hartwell's camera. The photographs show them in places that were important to them during their lives, and some of the images contain messages that might be warnings or requests for help." As if to illustrate his point, Margaret produced the photograph showing the word "justice" etched into the courthouse steps. A collective intake of breath swept through the assembled group, and several people leaned forward to get a better look at the impossible image. "Justice for what?" asked an older man whose calloused hands marked him as a lifetime farmer. What kind of justice could the dead be seeking? Maybe they're trying to tell us something about how they died, suggested a middle-aged woman whose black dress and worn expression identified her as one of the epidemic's many widows. There were so many who passed so quickly, and not all of their deaths made sense to those of us who were left behind. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air seeping through the church's broken windows. What do you mean their deaths didn't make sense? Some folks died who should have lived, the woman replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Young, healthy people who had no reason to succumb to influenza. Others lingered far longer than anyone expected, as if something was keeping them alive against their will. And then there were the ones who died after they should have recovered, added Mrs. Kowalski, her eyes still fixed on the photograph of her son. Johnny was getting better. The fever had broken. He was taking food again, even talking about getting back to work on the farm. Then one morning I found him cold in his bed, with no sign of what might have taken him in the night. Margaret's reporter instincts began to tingle with the possibility of a story far more significant than supernatural photography. Are you suggesting that some of the deaths during the epidemic might not have been natural? The group fell silent, and Margaret could sense the weight of unspoken secrets pressing down on them like storm clouds heavy with rain. Finally, Danny broke the silence with words that sent ice water coursing through her veins. We're suggesting that Sheriff Brennan might have had reasons for wanting certain people to die, Miss Hartwell. And we think your photographs might be the evidence we need to prove it. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the faces surrounding her in the flickering lamplight of the abandoned church. The accusation Danny Morrison had just made hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and she could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes studying her reaction with desperate intensity. These people had lost everything to drought and depression, and now they were suggesting that their loved ones had been murdered by the very man sworn to protect them. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Morrison, Margaret said, her voice barely steady despite her efforts to maintain professional composure. Do you have any evidence to support such a claim? An uncomfortable silence settled over the group like dust on abandoned furniture. Finally, an elderly man with silver hair and deeply lined hands cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had witnessed 8 decades of human folly and corruption. Name's Walter Chen, Miss Hartwell. My wife died in the 3rd wave of the epidemic, along with our youngest daughter. He paused to remove a worn photograph from his shirt pocket, studying it with eyes that held depths of sorrow Margaret could barely comprehend. May was getting better, just like Johnny Kowalski. Fever broke on a Tuesday. She was sitting up and asking for soup by Thursday. Then Sheriff Brennan came by the house on Friday evening, said he needed to check on the family's welfare as part of his official duties. Walter's voice grew quieter, forcing the assembled group to lean forward to catch his words. Found them both dead Saturday morning. No sign of struggle, no obvious cause. Dr. Henderson said it was probably a relapse, that sometimes the influenza came back stronger than before. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen in Brennan's eyes when he looked at my wife and daughter. What did you see? Margaret asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Fear, Walter replied, without hesitation. Fear and calculation. See, my wife kept the books for half the farms in this county, helped folks figure out their taxes and loans and such. She had a mind for numbers that could spot irregularities from across a room. And in the weeks before she died, she had been asking questions about some of the county's financial records, particularly the ones related to property seizures and tax sales. Margaret felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in her mind, forming a picture that was both clearer and more terrifying than anything she had imagined. Are you saying that your wife discovered evidence of corruption in the sheriff's department? I'm saying that May found discrepancies in the tax records that suggested someone was manipulating property assessments to force families off their land, Walter said, his voice growing stronger with each word. She was planning to take her findings to the state authorities in Oklahoma City, but she never got the chance. Danny Morrison rose from his seat and moved to stand beside Walter, his young face grave with purpose. It wasn't just the Chens, Miss Hartwell. Every person who died during the later stages of the epidemic had one thing in common. They knew something or possessed something that threatened Sheriff Brennan's control over this county. Margaret's mind raced through the implications of what she was hearing. If these people were telling the truth, then the influenza epidemic had provided perfect cover for a series of carefully orchestrated murders, eliminating witnesses and obstacles to a corrupt sheriff's accumulation of power and property. But even if their suspicions were correct, proving such allegations would require evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny, and the word of grieving family members would not be sufficient to challenge someone with Brennan's authority and connections. Even if what you're saying is true, Margaret said carefully, how do my photographs prove anything? The fact that I've somehow captured images of dead people doesn't constitute evidence of murder. Mrs. Kowalski stood and approached Margaret with slow, deliberate steps, her weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames of the kerosene lamps. Show her the photograph of the courthouse again, Danny. The one with the word carved into the stone. Danny retrieved the image from Margaret's portfolio and held it up for the group to see. In the flickering light, the word justice seemed to pulse with life, as if the letters themselves were breathing with the rhythm of a slowly beating heart. That carving wasn't there yesterday morning when we all gathered for the auction, Mrs. Kowalski said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. I've walked past those courthouse steps every Sunday for the past 40 years on my way to church, and I know every chip and crack in that limestone. Someone carved that word into the stone between the time you took this photograph and now. Margaret studied the image more closely, using the analytical skills she had developed during years of documentary photography. The carving appeared to be fresh, with sharp edges that hadn't yet been worn smooth by wind and weather. But the photograph had been taken 3 days earlier, during her initial survey of the county courthouse, and she was certain that no such inscription had been visible when she composed the shot. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she spoke the words, she remembered other details from her developed photographs that defied rational explanation. Messages written in dust, faces appearing in windows where no one had been standing, shadows that fell in directions contrary to the position of the sun. "Nothing's impossible when the dead have something urgent to say," said a voice from the back of the church. Margaret turned to see a woman she didn't recognize, someone whose presence seemed to command attention despite her unremarkable appearance. She was perhaps 50 years old, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun, and clothing that marked her as neither wealthy nor destitute. "This is Mrs. Elizabeth Brennan," Danny said, his voice carrying a note of significance that made Margaret's pulse quicken. The sheriff's wife. Margaret felt the world tilt around her like a ship in a storm. The wife of the man who had threatened to arrest her for trafficking with the dead was sitting in an abandoned church at midnight, participating in a clandestine meeting designed to expose his alleged crimes. The irony was so complete that Margaret wondered if she had somehow stumbled into a fever dream brought on by the oppressive Oklahoma heat. "Mrs. Brennan," Margaret said, struggling to find words adequate to the situation. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. I imagine you weren't, Miss Hartwell. But sometimes we find ourselves in places we never intended to go, doing things we never thought we would do." Elizabeth Brennan rose from her seat and moved toward the front of the church with the measured dignity of someone who had spent decades as the wife of a public official. "My husband is not a bad man, Miss Hartwell, but he is a weak one. And weakness can be more dangerous than evil when it's combined with power and opportunity." Margaret found herself holding her breath as Elizabeth continued speaking, her voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain and moral compromise. "The drought changed Thomas in ways I didn't recognize at first. As more and more families lost their farms to bankruptcy and foreclosure, He began to see opportunities for personal gain that he might have ignored during better times. It started small, arranging for properties to be assessed at values below their true worth, ensuring that his friends and political allies had advance notice of upcoming auctions, accepting small payments to delay eviction proceedings for families who could afford to buy themselves more time. Elizabeth paused and looked directly at Margaret, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like pools of still water. But as the depression deepened and the death toll from the epidemic mounted, Thomas's corruption became more systematic and more ruthless. He began to see the dead as problems solved rather than lives lost. "Are you saying that your husband murdered people during the influenza outbreak?" Margaret asked, her journalist's training compelling her to seek direct confirmation of the allegations she was hearing. "I'm saying that my husband administered medication to people who were recovering from the influenza, telling their families that he was delivering treatments prescribed by Dr. Henderson," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her admission. But Dr. Henderson left the county in early August, and the medications Thomas was administering were not treatments, but poisons designed to ensure that inconvenient recoveries became permanent departures. The church fell silent, except for the sound of wind whistling through broken windows and the soft hiss of burning kerosene. Margaret could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the knowledge that she had stumbled into a story that would either make her career or destroy her life, depending on how she chose to proceed. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked. "Why are you betraying your own husband?" "Because the dead won't let me sleep," Elizabeth said simply. "Because every night for the past year, I've been hearing voices calling for justice, and I know that those voices belong to the people my husband murdered. And because your photographs prove that I'm not going insane, that the dead really are trying to communicate with the living." Margaret felt a chill that seemed to penetrate her bones as she realized the full implications of Elizabeth Brennan's confession. If the sheriff's wife was willing to testify against her husband, and if Margaret's supernatural photographs could somehow be accepted as evidence in a court of law, then they might actually have enough material to expose the corruption that had turned a natural disaster into a cover for systematic murder. But even as hope began to flicker in her chest, Margaret remembered Sheriff Brennan's ultimatum and the power he wielded in Millfield County. Challenging him would require more than testimony and mysterious photographs. It would require courage of a kind she wasn't certain she possessed. "What do you want me to do?" Margaret asked, the question emerging from her lips before she could fully consider its implications. "We want you to stay," Danny Morrison said, speaking for the entire group. "We want you to keep taking photographs, to document whatever evidence the dead are trying to show us. And we want you to help us get that evidence to people in Oklahoma City who have the authority to investigate Sheriff Brennan's crimes. Your husband made it clear that I have until sunset to leave the county or face arrest," Margaret reminded Elizabeth. "How am I supposed to continue my work if I'm sitting in a jail cell?" Elizabeth smiled for the first time since Margaret had met her, an expression that transformed her careworn face into something approaching beauty. "Thomas doesn't patrol the abandoned sections of the county after dark, and there are dozens of empty buildings where you could set up a temporary darkroom without being detected. The boarding house is too exposed, but Mrs. Fletcher has a sister who lives in an abandoned farmhouse about 5 miles north of town. She's agreed to let you use her root cellar as a base of operations." Margaret felt the walls of the church closing in around her as she contemplated the choice before her. She could pack her belongings and leave Millfield County as Sheriff Brennan had demanded, returning to Tulsa with a collection of strange photographs and an incomplete story that would probably be dismissed as either fraud or fantasy. Or she could stay and risk everything to expose a conspiracy that had used a natural disaster as cover for systematic murder, trusting in the supernatural evidence provided by her impossible photographs and the testimony of people whose credibility would be questioned by any rational court. "If I stay and help you gather evidence against Sheriff Brennan, what guarantees do I have that you won't simply disappear or change your minds when the pressure becomes too intense?" Margaret asked. her reporter's instincts warning her that people who were desperate enough to make such accusations might also be desperate enough to abandon them when the consequences became real. The only guarantee any of us have is that the dead won't rest until justice is done, Walter Chen replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. And your photographs prove that the dead are more persistent than any of us imagined. Margaret looked around the circle of faces illuminated by the kerosene lamps, seeing in their expressions a mixture of hope, desperation, and determination that reminded her why she had become a journalist in the first place. These people had lost everything to forces beyond their control, but they were still fighting for something more valuable than property or prosperity. They were fighting for truth and justice in a world that seemed determined to deny both. "All right," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll stay. But if we're going to expose Sheriff Brennan's crimes, we need to be smart about it. We need more than supernatural photographs and emotional testimony. We need documentary evidence that will convince skeptics and survive legal challenges." Danny Morrison's smile was like sunrise breaking over the endless expanse of the Oklahoma plains. "That's exactly what the dead have been trying to tell us, Miss Hartwell. And we think your camera is the key to finding the evidence we need." As the midnight meeting dissolved and the conspirators prepared to return to their homes under cover of darkness, Margaret felt the weight of her decision settling around her shoulders like a shroud. She had committed herself to staying in Millfield County despite Sheriff Brennan's ultimatum, to continuing her supernatural photography despite the impossible nature of what her camera was capturing, and to helping expose a conspiracy of murder despite the danger such exposure would bring to everyone involved. But as she walked through the moonlit streets toward the abandoned farmhouse that would serve as her new base of operations, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the dead were walking beside her, their ghostly presence both comforting and terrifying in the pale Oklahoma night. The abandoned Hartley farmhouse squatted on the prairie like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, its broken windows staring blindly across fields that had once yielded wheat and corn, but now grew nothing except dust and regret. Margaret crept through the pre-dawn darkness toward the root cellar that would serve as her hidden darkroom, her camera bag bouncing against her hip with each careful step. 3 days had passed since Sheriff Brennan's ultimatum expired, and she had become a fugitive in her own country, sustained only by the determination to expose the truth that lay buried beneath Millfield County's veneer of small-town respectability. The root cellar door opened with a rusty squeal that made Margaret's heart hammer against her ribs. She descended wooden steps worn smooth by decades of use, breathing air that smelled of earth and preservation, of vegetables stored against winter's hunger, and secrets buried against discovery. Mrs. Fletcher's sister, Amelia Hartley, had prepared the space with meticulous care. Blackout curtains covered the single window. Chemical trays lined makeshift tables constructed from sawhorses and planks, and kerosene lamps provided the dim red illumination necessary for photographic development. Margaret lit one of the lamps and began the familiar ritual of preparing her chemicals, finding comfort in the precise measurements and careful timing that transformed latent images into visible truth. She had spent the previous day photographing abandoned properties throughout the county, focusing particularly on locations where epidemic victims had lived and died. The rolls of undeveloped film represented her best hope of gathering evidence that could support the allegations against Sheriff Brennan, but she approached the development process with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The first roll yielded images that seemed normal at first glance: empty farmhouses, barren fields, rusted machinery slowly surrendering to the relentless assault of wind and weather. But as Margaret studied the photographs more closely under the magnifying glass she had borrowed from Amelia Hartley's sewing kit, she began to notice details that defied rational explanation. In a photograph of the abandoned Morrison farm, She could clearly see the figure of a woman standing in the doorway of the collapsed barn, her face bearing the unmistakable features of Sarah Morrison, despite the fact that Danny's mother had been dead for more than a year. But more disturbing than the ghostly presence was what Sarah Morrison was holding in her translucent hands, a leather-bound ledger book that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Margaret's pulse quickened as she remembered Walter Chen's account of his wife's investigation into the county's financial records. Could the dead be trying to communicate the location of documentary evidence that would prove Sheriff Brennan's corruption? The possibility seemed absurd, but Margaret had long since abandoned any attempt to apply rational standards to the supernatural phenomena surrounding her work. The second roll contained even more explicit messages from the dead. In a photograph of the abandoned Presbyterian church where the midnight meeting had taken place, Margaret could see words written in the dust that covered the altar. Basement, and records, and truth. The letters appeared to have been traced by invisible fingers, creating a message that was both urgent and unmistakable. But it was the third roll that provided the most shocking revelation of all. Among the conventional images of rural desolation, Margaret discovered a photograph that showed Sheriff Brennan himself standing beside the county courthouse, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Nothing unusual about that, except for the fact that Margaret had taken the photograph at midnight, and Brennan had not been present when she composed the shot. More disturbing still was the expression on the sheriff's face, a cold smile that spoke of secrets kept and justice perverted, of power wielded without conscience or restraint. In his hands, clearly visible despite the supernatural circumstances of the photograph, Brennan held a small glass vial filled with clear liquid, the same type of container that might be used to store medicine or poison. Margaret's hands trembled as she studied the impossible image, searching for signs of double exposure or other technical explanations for what she was seeing. But her professional examination only confirmed what her eyes had already told her. The photograph was genuine, captured through normal processes and developed according to standard procedures. Somehow, her camera was documenting not just the present reality of Millfield County, but also hidden truths that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional perception. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs made Margaret's blood turn to ice water in her veins. She quickly extinguished the kerosene lamp and pressed herself against the earthen wall of the root cellar, her heart hammering so loudly that she was certain it could be heard throughout the abandoned farmhouse above. The footsteps paused at the cellar door, and Margaret held her breath as she waited to discover whether her hiding place had been compromised. "Miss Hartwell!" The voice belonged to Danny Morrison, but Margaret remained motionless until she heard the agreed-upon code phrase, "The dead are restless tonight, and the living are listening," Margaret replied, completing the exchange that would confirm Danny's identity and intentions. She relit the kerosene lamp and watched as the young farmer descended into the root cellar, his face grave with urgency. "We have a problem," Danny said without preamble. "Sheriff Brennan has issued a warrant for your arrest, charging you with trespassing, disturbing the peace, and practicing witchcraft. He's organizing search parties to sweep through every abandoned building in the county." Margaret felt the walls of the root cellar closing in around her like the sides of a grave. "Witchcraft? On what grounds?" "He's claiming that your photographs constitute evidence of supernatural practices designed to disturb the peace of the dead and corrupt the morals of the living." Danny's expression was grim, but not without hope. "The good news is that most of the search parties are made up of volunteers who have no real enthusiasm for finding you. Half the county thinks Brennan has lost his mind, and the other half is too scared of what you might reveal to want you captured." "What about the evidence?" Margaret gestured toward the photographs spread across the makeshift work table. "Have you had a chance to search the Presbyterian church basement for the records that are mentioned in these images?" Danny nodded and produced a canvas bag that clinked softly as he set it on the table. "Found them exactly where the photographs said they would be, hidden beneath a loose floorboard behind the furnace. Ledger books, tax records, correspondence with banks and government officials, all documenting a systematic scheme to manipulate property values and force families off their land. Margaret opened the bag and extracted several leather-bound volumes that smelled of mold and secrecy. The handwriting on the pages was small and precise, recording transactions and agreements that painted a picture of corruption extending far beyond Millfield County. Sheriff Brennan had been working with officials in the state capital, with bank executives and railroad representatives, with anyone who stood to profit from the systematic displacement of small farmers during the economic collapse. "This is incredible," Margaret whispered as she studied page after page of incriminating evidence. These records document bribes, kickbacks, fraudulent assessments, illegal seizures. It's enough to bring down half the political establishment in Oklahoma. "It's also enough to get us all killed if Brennan discovers what we've found," Danny replied soberly. "Which is why we need to get this evidence to authorities outside his jurisdiction as quickly as possible." Margaret was about to respond when she heard the sound of automobile engines in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Danny extinguished the kerosene lamp and moved to peer through a crack in the cellar door, his body tense with alarm. "Search party," he whispered. "At least 3 vehicles, maybe more. They're heading straight for the farmhouse." Margaret's mind raced through possibilities and alternatives as she stuffed the photographs and ledger books into her camera bag. The root cellar offered no escape route, except the stairs that led directly into the path of the approaching search party. And the sound of engines suggested that Brennan had committed significant resources to capturing her. "Is there another way out?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "There's a storm drain that connects to the old irrigation system," Danny replied, his voice tight with strain. "It runs beneath the farmhouse and emerges about a quarter-mile to the north, near the abandoned grain elevator. But it's been dry for 3 years, and parts of it may have collapsed." The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the prairie, followed by the harsh voices of men organizing themselves for a systematic search. Margaret could hear Sheriff Brennan's voice above the others, issuing orders with the authority of someone who expected immediate obedience. "Check every building, every cellar, every hiding place," Brennan commanded. "She's here somewhere, and I want her found before sunrise. The charge is practicing witchcraft, and the penalty is whatever I decide it should be." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool underground air. The sheriff's words carried an ominous tone that suggested her capture would result in something far worse than legal prosecution. She grabbed her camera bag and followed Danny to a narrow opening in the far wall of the root cellar, where rusted metal pipes disappeared into the darkness of the abandoned drainage system. The storm drain was barely wide enough for a human body, and Margaret had to crawl on her hands and knees through several inches of accumulated debris and stagnant water. The darkness was complete, pressing against her eyes like a physical weight, and the sound of her breathing seemed amplified to an almost unbearable volume. Behind her, she could hear the voices of the search party growing closer as they systematically worked their way through the abandoned farmhouse. The drainage pipe stretched ahead of her like a tunnel through the earth's bowels, and Margaret found herself thinking of burial and resurrection, of hidden truths emerging from their underground concealment. The ledger books in her camera bag represented documentary evidence of systematic corruption and murder, but they would be worthless if she couldn't survive long enough to deliver them to authorities who possessed both the power and the will to act on what they revealed. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Margaret saw a glimmer of pale light ahead, marking the drain's emergence near the abandoned grain elevator. She crawled faster, ignoring the pain in her knees and the water that soaked through her clothing, driven by the knowledge that Sheriff Brennan's search party would eventually discover the storm drain and follow her underground trail. She emerged from the drainage pipe like a mole surfacing from its burrow, gasping for clean air and blinking in the pre-dawn darkness. Danny Morrison was waiting for her beside the grain elevator, his face illuminated by the pale glow of approaching sunrise. "We need to move quickly," he said, helping her to her feet. "I've arranged for transportation to Oklahoma City, but we have to reach the rendezvous point before Brennan realizes which direction we've gone." Margaret looked back toward the Hartley farmhouse, where lights flickered like angry fireflies as the search party continued their systematic hunt. She could hear dogs barking in the distance, and she realized that Brennan had brought tracking animals to follow her scent through the abandoned buildings and drainage systems. "How long do we have?" she asked, clutching her camera bag like a lifeline. "Maybe an hour, maybe less," Danny replied grimly. "But if we can reach the highway before they pick up our trail, we might have a chance to get the evidence to people who can act on it." As they began running across the stubbled fields toward their uncertain rendezvous, Margaret felt the weight of her supernatural photographs and the stolen ledger books bouncing against her hip with each step. Behind them, the lights of Sheriff Brennan's search party spread across the abandoned farmstead like a wildfire, consuming the last evidence of human habitation on the drought-stricken prairie. The race between corruption and justice had begun in earnest, and Margaret knew that the outcome would determine not just her own survival, but the fate of everyone who had trusted her with their secrets and their hopes for redemption. The dead had shown her the path to truth, but it was up to the living to walk that path to its conclusion, regardless of the cost. The Oklahoma State Police Headquarters in Oklahoma City rose from the urban landscape like a fortress of law and order, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sunlight as Margaret Hartwell climbed the steps with her camera bag clutched against her chest. 3 days had passed since her harrowing escape from Millfield County. 3 days of hiding in safe houses and back rooms, while Danny Morrison and his network of allies arranged this crucial meeting with authorities who might have the power to act on the evidence she carried. Detective Lieutenant James Crawford was a man whose appearance suggested competence and integrity. Graying hair combed with military precision, steel-rimmed spectacles that reflected his analytical mind, hands that bore the calluses of someone who had worked his way up through the ranks, rather than relying on political connections. He studied Margaret's supernatural photographs with the methodical attention of a scientist examining specimens under a microscope, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound notebook that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of 20 years in law enforcement. "Miss Hartwell," Crawford said after examining the last of her impossible images, "I've seen many strange things during my career, but I've never encountered anything quite like these photographs. If they're genuine, and our technical experts believe they are, then you've documented phenomena that challenge everything we thought we knew about the relationship between the living and the dead." Margaret felt her heart racing as she watched Crawford open the canvas bag containing the ledger books recovered from the Presbyterian church basement. These documents represented the culmination of months of investigation by Walter Chen's wife and others who had paid for their curiosity with their lives. And Margaret knew that their contents could bring down not just Sheriff Brennan, but an entire network of corruption extending throughout the state government. "The financial records are even more compelling than the photographs," Crawford continued, his voice growing harder with each page he examined. "These documents detail a conspiracy involving multiple counties, dozens of officials, and millions of dollars in fraudulent property transactions. If this evidence is accurate, then the drought and depression have provided cover for the largest land grab in Oklahoma history." Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her voice barely above a whisper. "And the murders? Do the records support the allegations about Sheriff Brennan poisoning people during the influenza epidemic?" Crawford nodded grimly and produced a small glass vial from his desk drawer, identical to the one Margaret had seen in her supernatural photograph of Brennan. "We found this in the sheriff's office during our raid yesterday morning, along with several others containing various chemical compounds. Our laboratory analysis confirms that these substances would be lethal if administered to someone recovering from serious illness." The weight of validation settled on Margaret's shoulders like a shroud. Her impossible photographs had led to real evidence, documentary proof of systematic murder and corruption that would stand up in any court of law. The dead had somehow found a way to speak through her camera, revealing truths that the living had tried desperately to bury beneath layers of official denial and manufactured legitimacy. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Now we build cases that will survive legal challenges and political pressure," Crawford replied, his tone suggesting the magnitude of the task ahead. "Sheriff Brennan has been arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. But he's not the only one involved in this scheme, and some of his co-conspirators have connections that extend all the way to Washington." Margaret thought about the people she had left behind in Millfield County, the families who had trusted her with their secrets and their desperate hope for justice. They were still living under the shadow of corruption and fear, still vulnerable to retaliation from Brennan's allies and accomplices. "What about the families who provided information for this investigation? Are they safe?" "We've assigned protection details to the most vulnerable witnesses," Crawford assured her. "But I won't lie to you about the dangers they face. When conspiracies extend this high and involve this much money, the people responsible will go to considerable lengths to protect themselves." As if summoned by Crawford's words, a younger detective appeared in the doorway of the lieutenant's office, his face flushed with urgency. "Sir, we've received word from Millfield County. There's been an incident at the Presbyterian Church." Margaret's blood turned to ice water as Crawford gestured for the detective to continue his report. She could sense disaster in the young man's expression, the kind of catastrophe that occurred when desperate people made desperate choices. "Someone set fire to the church last night, sir. Completely destroyed the building and everything in it. The local fire department is calling it arson, but they don't have any suspects yet." Margaret felt the room spinning around her like a carousel gone mad. The Presbyterian Church had been the meeting place for their conspiracy against Brennan, the location where they had first shared their suspicions and planned their investigation. Its destruction represented more than property damage. It was a message from Brennan's allies that the conspiracy would continue despite his arrest. "Were there any casualties?" Crawford asked, his voice tight with concern. "No fatalities, sir, but several people were injured trying to save items from the burning building. Among them was Mrs. Elizabeth Brennan, the sheriff's wife. She suffered severe burns on her hands and arms." Margaret's heart clenched with guilt and sympathy. Elizabeth Brennan had risked everything to testify against her husband, providing crucial evidence that had made the investigation possible. Now she was paying the price for her courage, targeted by people who saw her betrayal as a threat to their continued operations. "I need to go back," Margaret said, rising from her chair with sudden determination. "These people trusted me with their secrets, and now they're being punished for helping expose the truth. I can't abandon them when they need support most." Crawford studied her with eyes that had seen too much human folly and courage to be easily surprised. "Miss Hartwell, returning to Millfield County would be extremely dangerous. Brennan may be in custody, but his network of allies and accomplices is still intact. They'll see you as the primary threat to their continued operations." "Then maybe it's time to give them something real to worry about," Margaret replied, her voice carrying a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I still have undeveloped film from my last day in the county. If the dead are still trying to communicate through my camera, maybe they have more evidence to share." Crawford was quiet for several long moments, studying Margaret's face as if trying to read the future in her expression. Finally, he opened his desk drawer and withdrew a small silver badge that gleamed like a star in the fluorescent lighting. "Consider yourself deputized as a special investigator for the state police, Miss Hartwell. It's not much protection against the forces you'll be facing, but it gives you official authority to pursue this investigation wherever it leads." Margaret pinned the badge to her jacket with fingers that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of official responsibility settling around her shoulders. She had come to Oklahoma as a freelance photographer, documenting rural poverty, but she was returning as an agent of justice carrying supernatural evidence of systematic murder and corruption. The drive back to Millfield County took Margaret through landscape that seemed frozen in perpetual drought. past abandoned farms and empty towns that bore witness to the economic and environmental catastrophe that had provided cover for human predators. As she approached the county line, she could see smoke still rising from the ruins of the Presbyterian church, a black column against the pale Oklahoma sky that marked the latest casualty in a war between truth and deception. Danny Morrison met her at the county line, his face bearing new lines of stress and determination that made him seem older than his 23 years. He drove her through back roads and abandoned sections of the county, avoiding the main highways where Brennan's remaining allies might be watching for her return. "How bad is it?" Margaret asked as they bounced through ruts worn deep by years of agricultural traffic. "Bad enough," Danny replied grimly. 3 families have left the county since the church burning, too scared to stay and wait for whatever comes next. But others are digging in, saying they won't be driven off their land by corruption and intimidation. They arrived at a new safe house, an abandoned schoolhouse that had been closed when the rural population dwindled below sustainable levels. Margaret set up her darkroom equipment in what had once been the principal's office, using blackout curtains and chemical trays to transform the space into a laboratory for developing impossible truths. The rolls of undeveloped film she had brought from Oklahoma City contained images that surpassed anything she had previously captured. In photograph after photograph, the dead appeared not as translucent figures haunting abandoned buildings, but as solid, corporeal beings standing alongside the living, their faces bearing expressions of determination and righteous anger that made Margaret's heart race with anticipation. One image showed the entire congregation of the Presbyterian church, living and dead, standing together in the ruins of their burned sanctuary, their faces illuminated by flames that seemed to burn with supernatural intensity. Another depicted Sheriff Brennan in his jail cell, surrounded by the ghostly figures of his victims, their hands reaching toward him with inexorable purpose. But the most remarkable photograph showed Margaret herself, standing in the courthouse square where her ordeal had begun, surrounded by dozens of translucent figures whose faces she now recognized from cemetery records and family photographs. They were the dead of Millfield County, and they were no longer content to remain silent witnesses to injustice. As Margaret studied the impossible images under her magnifying glass, she began to understand that her camera had become more than a tool for documentation. It had become a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, allowing voices that had been silenced by murder and corruption to speak once again. The sound of approaching vehicles made Margaret look up from her work, and through the schoolhouse windows, she could see headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Danny Morrison appeared in the doorway of her makeshift darkroom, his face grave with warning. "They've found us," he said simply. "Brennan's allies have organized their own search party, and they're not planning to take prisoners." Margaret gathered her photographs and camera equipment, knowing that the evidence she carried represented the only hope for justice in a county that had been ruled by fear and corruption for too long. As the sound of engines grew closer, and she prepared for whatever confrontation awaited in the darkness outside, she felt the presence of the dead walking beside her, their ghostly voices whispering encouragement and strength. The final battle for Millfield County was about to begin, and Margaret knew that both the living and the dead would be counting on her courage to see it through to its conclusion. The abandoned schoolhouse trembled as vehicles surrounded it like wolves circling wounded prey, their headlights carving harsh geometric patterns across the cracked plaster walls of what had once been a sanctuary of learning. Margaret Hartwell pressed herself against the window frame of the principal's office, her camera bag clutched against her chest as she counted at least 8 automobiles and twice as many armed men emerging from the darkness of the Oklahoma night. The leader of the group was immediately recognizable despite the shadows that obscured his features. Deputy Marcus Kellerman, Sheriff Brennan's second-in-command, and the man who had inherited control of the county's corruption network following his superior's arrest. Kellerman's voice carried across the schoolyard with the authority of someone who had never been challenged by consequences or accountability. "Miss Hartwell, we know you're in there," he called, his words echoing off the empty buildings that surrounded the abandoned school. "You've caused enough trouble for one county, and it's time to put an end to your meddling in affairs that don't concern you." Margaret felt Danny Morrison's presence beside her as they crouched below the windowsill, studying the deployment of armed men who had taken positions around every possible exit from the building. The young farmer's face was grim but determined, and she could see in his expression the same resolve that had sustained his family through generations of hardship and adversity. "How many rounds do you have for that camera of yours?" Danny whispered, his attempt at humor failing to mask the gravity of their situation. "Enough," Margaret replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But I think it's time to find out whether the dead are willing to do more than pose for photographs." She opened her camera bag and withdrew the most recent images she had developed, studying them by the pale moonlight that filtered through the broken windows. The photographs showed dozens of ghostly figures standing throughout Millfield County, their translucent faces bearing expressions of righteous anger and long-delayed vengeance. If her camera had truly become a bridge between the living and the dead, then perhaps it was time to test the limits of that supernatural connection. Margaret attached her most powerful flash unit to her camera and loaded a fresh roll of film, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had documented the evidence of systematic murder and corruption, had helped expose the conspiracy that had used natural disaster as cover for human predation. But now she faced a choice that would determine whether justice would triumph or be buried beneath another layer of violence and intimidation. "Miss Hartwell," Kellerman's voice carried a note of impatience that suggested his patience was reaching its limits. "You have 60 seconds to surrender yourself and all photographic materials in your possession. After that, we'll be forced to take more direct action." Margaret rose from her concealed position and moved to the broken window that faced the schoolyard, her camera raised like a weapon against the assembled forces of corruption. In the viewfinder, she could see not just the living men who threatened her, but also the growing number of ghostly figures who were materializing in the spaces between the automobiles, their ethereal forms becoming more solid and substantial with each passing moment. "I have something to show you, Deputy Kellerman," Margaret called, her voice carrying across the night air with surprising strength. "Something that concerns all the people you and Sheriff Brennan murdered during the influenza epidemic." Kellerman's laugh was harsh and dismissive, the sound of someone who had never been held accountable for his actions, and saw no reason to expect accountability now. "You're talking about dead people, Miss Hartwell. Dead people don't testify in court, and they don't vote in elections. They're just memories, and memories can be forgotten when the people who carry them disappear." Margaret raised her camera and triggered the flash unit, its brilliant burst of light illuminating the schoolyard with the intensity of artificial lightning. For a moment, the assembled men were blinded by the sudden glare, shielding their eyes and cursing as their night vision was destroyed by the photographer's strobe. But as the light faded and their vision cleared, they found themselves facing something that challenged every assumption they had ever made about the relationship between the living and the dead. Standing among them, as solid and present as any living person, were the ghostly figures of everyone who had died during Sheriff Brennan's systematic campaign of murder. Walter Chen stood beside the lead automobile, his weathered hands resting on the hood as he stared directly at Deputy Kellerman, with eyes that burned with supernatural fire. Sarah Morrison stood in the schoolhouse doorway, her translucent form blocking the exit that Kellerman had planned to use for his assault. Mrs. Kowalski's son, Johnny, materialized beside one of the armed men, his young face bearing the marks of the fever that had claimed his life, but also a determination that transcended physical death. The reaction from Kellerman's men was immediate and visceral, shouts of fear and confusion, the sound of weapons being dropped as hands shook too violently to maintain their grip, the roar of automobile engines as several of the conspirators abandoned their positions and fled into the darkness of the Oklahoma night. But Kellerman himself stood his ground, his face pale but his voice steady as he addressed the impossible gathering of the dead. "Tricks and illusions," he said, though his words carried less conviction than his tone suggested. "Smoke and mirrors designed to frighten simple people into believing in ghost stories." Margaret triggered her flash unit again, and with each burst of light, more ghostly figures appeared throughout the schoolyard. Men and women who had died during the influenza epidemic. Families who had been driven from their land by fraudulent tax assessments. Children who had succumbed to diseases that should have been treatable, but had been allowed to progress to fatal conclusions. They stood in silent judgment of the living men who had orchestrated their deaths, their ethereal presence growing more solid and substantial with each photographic flash. Margaret realized that her camera was not simply documenting the supernatural, but actually facilitating the return of the dead, providing them with the energy and substance needed to manifest in the physical world. "You can't fight the dead, Deputy Kellerman," Margaret called from her position at the schoolhouse window. "They have nothing left to lose, and they've been waiting a long time for justice." Kellerman raised his pistol with hands that trembled despite his efforts to maintain composure, pointing the weapon at the ghostly figure of Walter Chen. "I don't care if you're alive or dead," he snarled. "A bullet will stop you either way." He pulled the trigger, and the gunshot echoed across the abandoned schoolyard like thunder rolling across the prairie. But instead of striking Walter Chen's ethereal form, the bullet passed harmlessly through the ghostly figure and embedded itself in the tire of Kellerman's own automobile, causing the vehicle to settle with a deflated hiss. The dead began to move with purpose and coordination, surrounding the remaining members of Kellerman's group with the inexorable advance of justice too long delayed. They made no sound as they closed in, but their presence was more terrifying than any vocal threat could have been. Margaret continued photographing the supernatural confrontation, her flash unit providing stroboscopic illumination of scenes that defied every rational explanation. Through her viewfinder, she watched as the corrupt officials who had profited from murder and fraud found themselves face to face with their victims, forced to confront the human cost of their greed and ambition. One by one, Kellerman's remaining allies broke ranks and fled, abandoning their leader to face the consequences of his choices alone. Soon only the deputy remained in the schoolyard, surrounded by dozens of ghostly figures whose patience had finally reached its end. "What do you want from me?" Kellerman whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the abandoned buildings. Walter Chen stepped forward, his ethereal form shimmering in the moonlight as he spoke with a voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave. "Confession," he said simply. "Truth. Justice for the families you destroyed and the lives you stole." Margaret watched through her camera lens as Kellerman's resolve finally crumbled under the weight of supernatural judgment. The deputy fell to his knees in the dust of the schoolyard, his weapon forgotten as he began to speak in a voice broken by fear and remorse. "We never meant for it to go so far," he said, his words carrying across the night air like a prayer for forgiveness. "It started with small things, adjusting tax assessments to help our friends, delaying evictions for families who could pay us to buy more time. But when the epidemic started, Brennan saw an opportunity to solve all our problems at once." The confession poured out of Kellerman like water from a broken dam, years of accumulated guilt and fear finally finding release in the presence of those he had wronged. He detailed the systematic poisoning of epidemic victims who posed threats to the conspiracy, the manipulation of property records to facilitate fraudulent seizures, the network of corruption that extended throughout the state government. Margaret documented every word with her camera, capturing not just Kellerman's confession, but also the ghostly audience that bore witness to his admission of guilt. The dead listened with expressions of grim satisfaction, their long wait for acknowledgement finally reaching its conclusion. As dawn began to break over the Oklahoma prairie, the supernatural manifestations gradually faded, the ghostly figures becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely as the natural light overwhelmed Margaret's artificial illumination. But their purpose had been accomplished. Justice had been acknowledged. Truth had been spoken. And the conspiracy that had used natural disaster as cover for human predation had finally been exposed in its entirety. Detective Lieutenant Crawford arrived with a convoy of state police vehicles just as the last of the ghostly figures vanished into the morning light. He found Margaret sitting on the schoolhouse steps, her camera equipment scattered around her like the tools of some arcane ritual, her face bearing the exhaustion of someone who had witnessed the impossible and lived to document it. "Miss Hartwell," Crawford said as he approached, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. "We heard gunshots and came as quickly as we could. Are you injured?" Margaret looked up at the detective with eyes that had seen beyond the veil of ordinary reality, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she had experienced. "I'm fine, Lieutenant. But I think you'll find that Deputy Kellerman has some things he wants to tell you about Sheriff Brennan's activities during the influenza epidemic." Crawford looked across the schoolyard where Kellerman knelt in the dust, his hands raised in surrender, and his face bearing the expression of someone who had finally abandoned all pretense of innocence. The deputy's confession would provide the final piece of evidence needed to dismantle the conspiracy that had terrorized Millfield County, ensuring that justice would be served for both the living and the dead. As the state police took Kellerman into custody and began processing the scene, Margaret packed her camera equipment with the careful attention of someone who understood that she had participated in events that would never be fully explained or entirely believed. Her photographs would serve as evidence in the trials that would follow, but the supernatural elements of her documentation would remain her secret, shared only with the families who had trusted her with their hopes for justice. In the weeks that followed, Millfield County began the slow process of healing from the corruption that had infected its institutions and the natural disasters that had devastated its landscape. New officials were elected, honest men and women who understood that public service was a trust to be honored rather than an opportunity to be exploited. The fraudulent property seizures were reversed, and families who had been driven from their land were able to return to rebuild their lives. Margaret's photographs were exhibited in galleries throughout the country, documenting not just the human cost of the Great Depression, but also the resilience of people who refused to surrender their dignity in the face of overwhelming adversity. The supernatural elements of her work remained unacknowledged in the official records, but those who had witnessed the events in Millfield County understood that some truths transcended the boundaries of conventional documentation. The dead had found their voice through Margaret's camera, and their message had been heard by the living. Justice had been served, truth had been acknowledged, and the covenant between the living and the dead had been renewed in the most unlikely of places. A drought-stricken county in Oklahoma, where corruption had flourished until it was exposed by the one force that could not be intimidated, bought, or silenced. As Margaret prepared to leave Millfield County for the final time, she stood once more in the courthouse square, where her ordeal had begun, her camera raised toward the morning sky. Through her viewfinder, she could see only the ordinary reality of a small town struggling to rebuild itself. But she knew that somewhere beyond the reach of conventional perception, the dead continued their eternal watch over the living, ready to bear witness whenever justice was threatened by the corruption of those who had forgotten that power was a trust to be honored rather than a license to exploit. The photographer of the Dust Bowl had completed her assignment, but her true work was just beginning.